Good evening. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Baker Institute. I'm George Abbey, a senior fellow in space policy here at the Institute. And Ambassador Derision expressed just his regrets, but he had a commitment that he couldn't get out of this evening. But we really are pleased that you have come for this evening's program. This is the third evening in a three-part program that we've been presenting on the space program: the past, the present, and the future. And Monday night we talked about the past with the Apollo program, and John Young was here telling us about the Apollo program and our successes in the past. And last evening we had three individuals talk to us about the space shuttle and the space station program, which is really the present. And this evening we're going to look to the future and not only consider human space flight, but also robotic spacecraft. And we have a panel that I think can address all those topics. But it's very timely for us to be looking at the space program, considering the aftermath of the Columbia accident and the interest of the administration and the Congress and the nation on where we're going to go in space. And so I think it is quite timely. And certainly this month is a very historic month in considering aviation and space. It was 100 years ago this month, on December 17th, that the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, and that'll be celebrated next week. And the President will appear at that occasion, and perhaps will say something about the space program. But they're looking at what the future of the space program is, and have been doing that for a number of months. And this month also marks the 35th anniversary of man's first flight out of Earth orbit with Apollo 8, and that was 35 years ago this December. So those are two, I think, very historic occasions that occurred during the month of December. And we feel it certainly is in order for us to look at the program and where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Space plays an integral part in all our lives now. A lot of us aren't really aware of what has become second nature to us. But certainly the news that we rely on, our banking and our communications, all the data that flows to us so readily during the day, a lot of that is coming through us through our space assets. And certainly the space program, the robotic space program, and the human spaceflight program, and man's exploration of the moon has also increased our scientific knowledge and understanding of the planet and certainly the heavens. So as we look to the future, I think it's important to look at where we are going in space and what our space program is going to be. We're very fortunate tonight to have a moderator, a very experienced moderator, who has served as the President's science advisor and is here now at Rice and is here at the Baker Institute and is a senior fellow for science and technology. So let me turn it over to Neil Lane, who will be our moderator this evening, and he will present, I think, our very distinguished panel. Neil?
Thank you very much, George, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you particularly for helping doing the lion's share of the work, in fact, and bringing together such extraordinary individuals for these events. It's been a wonderful program. I've learned a lot and enjoyed it the previous two nights, and I know tonight is no exception. Since Ed Derision was at the last minute not able to attend tonight, let me just say a word about the Baker Institute. Many of you know the Baker Institute is a relatively new organization at Rice, just celebrating its 10th anniversary with a wonderful gala a month or so ago. It is for the purpose of bridging the gap between theory and practice and policy, and pulling together experts from government, from academia, from industry and business, from sort of all professional walks of life, to try to help bridge the gap between theory and, if you don't like the word theory, the best ideas, if you like, about where we ought to go and actually getting there. Mr. Baker himself often says leadership is about knowing what to do and then doing it, and that's certainly what the Institute is trying to make happen. It is an integral part of Rice. The Institute does not offer degrees. It does not sponsor courses, but is very helpful in generating ideas for curriculum and has a wonderful group of students, the Baker Student Forum, associated with and actively involved, actually, with the work of the Baker Institute. You met many of those students here tonight. It also has a wonderful donor group called the Round Table, so if you're inclined that way, it's a wonderful, wonderful way to be more closely involved with the work of the Baker Institute. So then let me say what a great honor it is for me to be a moderator for such a distinguished panel. I do apologize for my appearance. It's what little I can do for my dermatologist. When I was in Washington, I used to just say, when I look like this, it was a rough hearing this afternoon. Many of us have had that experience. Also, in the spirit of full disclosure, I must say that I am an unrepentant space cadet. I have loved space since the first days I could remember. I wanted to be an astronaut. I flunked my first centrifuge test, which actually was a merry-go-round, and I was 5 years old. Not to give up, I tried the merry-go-round 2 or 3 more times, but I was sick every time, so I decided this is not going to be for me. But when I got to the White House, I got to be President Clinton's science guy, because being his science advisor, I was his space advisor. So then I really was excited to get involved, more closely involved with the work of NASA and our space effort more broadly, including that in the military and in industry. Got a chance to come to Johnson Space Center to suit up in the orange suits. And I don't know if our colleagues will tell you, but they do wear diapers under the orange suits. I took a diaper back to the White House to show it to the White House staff at the morning staff meeting. It was a fresh diaper. It was not but just to show them what it was really all about. It was very exciting to see the space station go up, see the construction of a station that had been a vision for a very long time and had been in the building on ground for a very long time, but it was wonderful to see it finally in space as an extraordinary example of U.S. international cooperation in space, and particularly with our partners, the Russians. So that was a very exciting thing. It is true that much science has been done in space now by scientists, by astronauts, including the work, of course, on the space station, but the work in the repair and upgrade of the Hubble telescope, quite extraordinary. But it's also true that wonderful science has been done in space without the human presence in space through robotic means. One recalls these extraordinary planetary missions that, with few exceptions, were really quite stunning successes and taught us a great deal about our solar system. This evening we have a wonderful panel of experts with, I hope, a diversity of views on all these matters. We're going to hear from them. Each of these amazing individuals deserves a very long introduction, but I promise you will not get that from me because we want to hear from them. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of them now in the order they are in the program, whereas they're sitting in front of you in a different order. The good news is the person behind the sign is actually the person that's on the sign. We thought about doing that also, but I think this probably makes more sense. So I'll introduce all of them right now, and then I'll ask them to come up in turn, make some comments, and then we'll have questions and have a discussion, and we won't finish too late, I think, but I know the discussion is going to be a stimulating one, and I certainly look forward to that. And then we have a reception after the session where we can continue these kind of discussions. So let me start by introducing Christopher Stott. We are very appreciative to Chris for coming on very short notice because Jay Honeycutt, who's on your program, has the flu, and we're very sorry that he has the flu, and we're, of course, very sorry that he couldn't be with us, but much appreciative to Chris for filling in on very short notice. Chris Stott is President and CEO of Mansat Limited and Mansat LLC. Stott is the originator of the Mansat concept as well as a co-founder. Mansat Limited is the world's first private satellite registry. Mansat is assisting the Isle of Man government in the preparation of its orbital filings to the International Telecommunication Union for all Earth orbits and associated radio frequencies, with special focus on geostationary orbit. Prior to leaving for Mansat in 2000, Stott was the Director of International Commercialization and Sales with Lockheed Martin Space Operations, Consolidated Space Operations Contract. Also employed in international business development for Boeing Space and Communication Company He interned in the U.S. Senate. He worked for the deputy and campaign chairman of 2 presidential campaigns, which should give you hero medals of certain kinds. In Europe, he worked as a speechwriter and office manager for the British Parliament, which should give you more hero medals. He obtained a Bachelor of Arts in American Studies, Politics and Government at the University of Kent, and he holds master's degrees in Space Studies, School of Business Management and Law from the International Space University in Strasbourg, France. Dr. Gene Levy is Howard R. Hughes Provost and Professor of Physics and Astronomy at Rice University. He studied at Rutgers and the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD in 1971. He joined the University of Arizona, where he held appointments as Professor of Planetary Science and Professor of Physics. And from 1983 to 1994, he served as head of the Planetary Sciences Department and director of the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory. He has received many honors and awards. He is a space scientist. He's a physicist, first and foremost, I would add. And one of the things he did at Arizona was to establish the NASA Arizona Space Grant College Consortium, and he served as director of that for 11 years. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of Associated Universities Incorporated. He served as a member of the NASA Planetary Protection Advisory Committee and the NASA Nuclear Systems Initiative Science Definition Team. And as former provost at Rice, let me just say how fortunate we are here to have attracted Gene to our campus, because he has brought enormous intellect, energy, and vision to Rice, and we appreciate him being with us on this panel this evening. Charlie Precourt is a graduate of the Air Force Academy and Naval War College, test pilot, became an astronaut in 1990. He has flown 4 flights in space, 2 as commander of international crews. He flew as the pilot on the Space Shuttle Atlantis on the first shuttle mission to dock with the Russian space station Mir. He commanded 2 additional missions to Mir, one on Atlantis and the final shuttle flight on Mir, to Mir on Discovery. He served as Director of Operations for NASA at the Georgian Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia, and served as the Chief of the Astronaut Corps for 4 years until he became the Deputy Manager of the International Space Station Program in 2002, a really big job. He's married with 3 daughters, one of whom graduated from Rice this past year, and must be very smart, and is working here at the Baker Institute, I'm very proud to say. Dr. Lee Silver presently serves as W.M. Keck Foundation Professor and Professor for Resource Geology Emeritus at California Institute of Technology. Lee Silver has had a long and distinguished career as scientist. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of a number of societies, recipient of innumerable awards and honors, including the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal, played a major role in all the lunar science surface activities for Apollo 15, 16, and 17, and trained crews for these missions on lunar surface geology. He also played a major role in the analysis of lunar surface samples returned from the moon. If you have any rocks with you, you can bring them up. He will tell you exactly what those rocks are, where they came from.
Only lunar rock.
I think if you have any lunar rocks, you're in some degree of trouble. Lee has served on a number of advisory committees, Committee on the Redesign of the Space Station, 1993, 94. He's been at Caltech since 1952, serving as a research geologist, an assistant professor, and subsequently as professor of geology. Vladimir Titov is a Russian cosmonaut born in the Chita region of Russia. He served as an aviator in the Russian Air Force and was selected as a cosmonaut in 1976. He flew his first flight as commander of Soyuz T-8 in 1983. They were to work with, he and his crew were to work with and repair the Russian space station, Soyuz 7. The Soyuz radar antenna had been torn off when the Soyuz payload shroud separated after launch, and the rendezvous was aborted after an unsuccessful attempt was made with only an optical sight and ground radar inputs. But he came back. His second flight was as commander of Soyuz T-10, also 1983. However, a valve in the propellant line failed, causing a large fire at the base of the launch vehicle. I think we could have a look at the video, which will come up in just a second. It's a very short video, but it gives you a rough idea of what it might have been like. It's not a normal liftoff. Okay, but you look at him scratch his neck there. Yes. The automatic abort sequence failed as the wires involved burned through, but the Soyuz escape system was activated by radio commands from the blockhouse. The crew experienced, unless this is a typo, 15 to 17 Gs during abort and landed 2.5 miles away. Let me tell you, 15 Gs will take your breath away. Not one to be discouraged. He was next assigned to command Soyuz TM-2 and to fly a long-duration fly on Mir, but he and his flight engineer were replaced by a backup crew due to concerns about his flight engineer's health. Okay? He's still with us. He then was assigned as commander of Soyuz TM-4 and flew a long-duration mission on board Mir and returned to Earth in 1988 after setting a new record for spaceflight, 365 days, 22 hours, and 39 minutes, exceeding the duration of 1 year in space for the first time. He subsequently was assigned to Houston and flew on 2 space shuttle missions, returning to Mir on Discovery in 1995 and again on Atlantis in 1997. He subsequently retired from the Russian Air Force, and he works for the Boeing Company in Moscow as Director for Space and Communications, Russia, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And our last panelist, caught in traffic, I think, is Charlie Bolden, who attended the U.S. Naval Academy, entering the Marine Corps upon graduation, and flew more than 100 sorties in Vietnam as a Marine aviator. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School in 1979 and was selected an astronaut in 1980. He's flown 4 space shuttle flights: on Columbia in January of '86, just prior to the loss of Challenger; on Discovery, launching the Space Shuttle Telescope; and on Atlantis, flying a Space Lab scientific mission and the first historic international mission with a Russian cosmonaut again on Discovery. He later returned to the Marine Corps and served as Deputy Commandant of Midshipmen at the U.S. Naval Academy and retired as Major General, serving as the Wing Commander of the 3rd Marine Air Wing. He's now Senior Vice President of Tech Transfer International, and which is a company responsible for translating, it's Tech Trends International. It's a company responsible for translating and interpreting languages around the world. And they have a major role, obviously, in supporting U.S. space activities in Russia and here in the U.S., and are involved in supporting other technical interchanges in other languages around the world. So I really, as I said at the very beginning, I'm quite honored to moderate this panel, and so I'll ask our panelists one at a time to come up and say whatever they'd like to for a few minutes, and then we will take questions. And General Bowden, if you're willing to do it, can we start with you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Let me start by apologizing sincerely for my rudeness in getting here late, and it was partially traffic, and the other part was my lack of knowing what Houston traffic's like, coming from the northwest side of town. Let me make just a few brief remarks. I look around the audience, and there are a number of you who, like me, have been to. This is our 3rd night here. And so I think many of you who know me know that I always say God works in mysterious ways. I think perhaps God was trying to keep me away from the panel tonight, because I will, believe it or not, I will attempt to be the devil's advocate on the panel. George and I talked about this a little bit last night, because I mentioned to him that I was a big proponent of robotic space exploration. He said, "No, but you're not supposed to do that. That's not why we're bringing you here." And so I will start by saying, hopefully we will get into some enriched discussion this evening about robotic versus human space exploration. Second thing I'll say is my read on this panel was that you wanted us to be very candid in the closing part of the week and tell you what our feelings are about our future in space. So I'm going to do 2 things, and hopefully it'll take me no longer than about 2 or 3 minutes to say this, and then I'll sit down and listen to the rest of the people who have prepared remarks. I have 2 feelings about our future in space. One is good and one is bad. Let me tell you the bad feeling initially. And some of you will take this wrong, and I apologize, because you will think it's political. It's not. It's my observation on life. Unlike, I think, most members of the panel, I've had an opportunity to come from one environment into the NASA environment and go back to my environment and now be in a third. So I've had 3 lives watching the space program. 4 lives if you count what happened prior to my becoming an astronaut, which, unlike most of the astronauts on the panels this week, was not my lifelong ambition. I never dreamed of going to space, unlike most of the other people, because where I grew up, that was not possible in my mind. So you have to understand my perspective on everything. Were it not for George Abbey, to be quite honest, I probably would have never had an opportunity to experience what I experienced. So I will give you my perceptions. The bad side. Because of where our heart is right now in this nation, and because of where our purse is in this nation, I have a very dim view of the future of human space exploration. I also have a not refreshing view of robotic space exploration, because we don't have a good way of telling what our accomplishments are in robotic space exploration. I think the panel, who will give you facts and figures, will tell you we have had an unbelievably incredible success rate with our robotic space exploration for the last 20 years or more. And when you come into this last decade, it's been phenomenal. If you talk about what we have done since my last flight in space in 1994, it's been incredible. You look at the accomplishments of the Hubble Space Telescope, and that's my baby. That's my pride and joy. George will tell you that prior to our flight, when I was named to the Hubble Space Telescope crew, almost instantly our crew realized that we were going to be a part of something incredibly unreal, that we would be a part of something that would be historic and everything else. And we had no idea that Hubble would end up doing what it has done and bringing us into the acceptance and the knowledge and incredible, if you will, awareness of our universe the way it has. You can go back to a number of other robotic vehicles, the Mars rovers. It goes on and on. Viking, just you name it. We know what we know today because of our robotic exploration of space. We have been able to put the fine point on that, however. We have been able to cross the I's, to dot the I's and cross the T's because of what we have been able to do with human space exploration, where we take the most incredible computer that God has ever allowed us to feel and experience, the human brain, along with the machine that it heads, and we've been able to go out and take advantage of what we've learned from robotic exploration and go out and ask additional questions that we needed to do. So while I am a big fan of human space exploration, robotic exploration is incredibly important, and we must not give up on that. We must somehow find a way to convince the leaders of our nation, and I say our nation, because I don't think the rest of the world needs any convincing. Unfortunately, I think in this particular case, we trail the rest of the world in understanding the value of space exploration, both human and robotic. I was depressed in the traffic coming over here, listening to what's going on today in a place that is meaningful to me because I have young Marines who were in Iraq. They went there for a reason. And I think while you may think that has nothing to do with space, it has everything to do with space, because it speaks loads about our relationship with our partner nations and our inability to get along with them and our inability to accept the value that they bring. And we cannot do this job of space exploration alone. So I'm going to sit down. I got the conversation started. I'll let the details come up, and then maybe I can answer some questions later. But I'm worried. I'm not very confident that we're going in the right direction. I am confident, overly confident, that we have the ability to do all the right things. I have no doubt that we have the ability to do the right things, to effectively combine robotic and human space exploration so that we do what God wants us to do, which is to ask the question why, or why not, and how. And that's what space allows us to do. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the questions that come.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Let's just proceed in the order that's in the program. So let me ask Christopher Stott, please, make his comment.
Thank you. It's quite difficult to follow Charlie, but I'll try my best. But I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. And on behalf of Jay Honeycutt, who I'm sort of speaking in lieu of, he sends his deepest personal apologies. And it really is a quite terrible case of the flu that he has. But I know he very much was looking forward to being here, because Houston really is his hometown. He might be in Washington at the moment, but this is where his heart is, and certainly with the space program. Just to take a little aside, a little like Charlie, I wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for George. And the work that he has done and Jay has done and many others in this room have done in pushing the envelope and the space frontier forward. Please don't underestimate the role that America plays in the world, the leadership role in space, what you have done to inspire all of humanity. The work that you've done in the Apollo program, the Space Shuttle program, and now the Space Station program is captivating young minds everywhere. It's something that everyone looks up to. And it truly breaks my heart, really breaks my heart, to see the American program in limbo at the moment. The one nation that has the guidance, the willpower, the energy, the drive to do anything it sets its mind to, seems adrift and lost, both in human and robotic exploration. As Charlie was saying, the rest of the world sees great value in space. Space budgets everywhere else in the world are going up. The Chinese launching their first astronaut a few short months ago. The Indians have a manned program underway. They're working very hard at that. They have increased their space budget every year for the last 15 years. The Japanese, despite their problems and despite their failures, are pushing on. The Europeans, with the European Union and ESA, are having a new renewed vigor in space. The South American nations are putting together a unilateral space agency, or trying to. And everyone turns to you for leadership. And everyone looks to America. And again, what is happening at the moment is tragic. But it can be solved, and it can be fixed. And it's purely a matter of willpower and speaking up and doing the job that is ahead of us. We're at a real turning point in terms of space. A real cusp, as they say, a decision point, an inflection. Humanity, Captain Young talked about this a lot on Monday night in his speech. He touched on this many times. Humanity is facing overpopulation pressures. We're facing pollution pressures. We're facing resource pressures. We don't have enough resources in this world to give everyone everything they want. Whereas just as we're starting to face these terrible, terrible pressures on energy, oil, water, name a substance, we're short of it. Except for people. Keep on making more of those. Just as we start having these problems, we have a solution. And I know we've read about this since the beginning of the space age. From the early Russian leadership in this area, way back to the turn of the century with its visionaries, all the way through even to H.G. Wells, one of my fellow countrymen, and Jules Verne and Wernher von Braun. They've always talked about the resources that space can offer humanity. The reason, the sole reason to explore space, the only reason, must be the survival of humanity. It must be to gather and garner resources to make our lives better down here. That's what the other nations of the world see. Look at the Chinese and what they're doing. Read past the first paragraph in their press releases when they talk about national pride. The second thing they talk about is resources. Everybody else is seeing this, except here in the United States. And yet you are the only people that have the means to go do this. My country, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, we fell behind in the race back in '87. Almost 20 years ago, we gave up the ghost. One of those post-Second World War, politics of moral decline. We cut back our space programs, and it's killed our country. It's a terrible shame. I'm actually from a place called the Isle of Man, tiny separate country. A few friends in the audience have had their ear bent on this many times. But we have actually taken up the mantle. We want to do a lot of work in space. We only have 75,000 people. We don't have many resources. But we look here to the United States as to what you've done in the past and what you're still trying to do today. And we take great heart in what you're doing. We're actually turning our economic abilities as an offshore financial center to the space industry, trying to sort of bring that third element of art, science, engineering, and business into the mix. Because even though the human space flight at the moment, with the terrible tragedy of Columbia, and recently with the loss of some robotic missions, albeit spy satellites, things aren't going too well in space, but there is a space industry that is thriving, and that we never talk about it. Somehow, in the last 20 years, these two different industries have gone off in different directions. The human and public government space agencies and work has gone off this way, and the commercial activities have gone completely the opposite direction. Last year was a really bad year for commercial activities in outer space, and we still made $100 billion. To put that into perspective, Hollywood grossed $9 billion last year. And yet that's everything from satellite TV, phone calls, internet data, GPS. It's a thriving industry. I mean, export control is hammering the American side of that. Again, America shot themselves in the foot on that one. We're still trying to figure out why. People want to buy American satellites and launch vehicles, but we're not allowed to. It's a terrible it's a travesty. But again, we're talking openly and candidly, and I know I'll probably get slapped for some of this stuff afterwards. But there's a thriving business in outer space, and yet humans aren't involved in it. So when we talk about human exploration, we should also start thinking about human utilization of outer space. We need to put into practice the ability to go work in space, not just explore, to take advantage of what we've learned on Skylab, on Mir, on the Salyut stations, and we're learning today on the International Space Station. And we need to change. And how do we change it? People always talk about funding. I grew up in a banking family, and believe me, every industry in the world, every industry, even the dot-coms at the height of their business prowess, were always wanting more money. One of the things to say that to throw more money at something isn't always a cure. Everybody always wants more money. But one of the things that we believe fundamentally on the Isle of Man that we can bring to this, and the one direction that we see where you can fundamentally change space activities, isn't science, it's not engineering, it's not the laws of physics, it's not the laws of nature, it's not the laws given down to us by God. It is the laws of man. We have hamstrung ourselves with regulations and laws that are actively, on a daily basis, preventing our push out commercially into outer space. There's the outer space treaties, which are a good bedrock, but there's various liability conventions, registration conventions, lunar treaties, things that were written back in the 70s and 80s, which reflect a more Cold War view of the world, where you had this sort of, very sort of a socialist viewpoint that would come into things about the ownership of private property. For example, there's fleets of geostationary satellites out there, over 289 of them at the moment, worth about $250 million each, are all literally, and I hand on heart, I teach space law as well, operating outside of the law, outside of international law at the moment, because you're not allowed to have any private property rights in outer space. Certain nations haven't delimited where their space law begins and their aviation law stops. A lot of equatorial nations, these satellites on the equatorial belt, say my space law begins over here. I want to tax those things. I mean, there's a huge mess on law out there. But what that mess means is that when people say, okay, I want to do a commercial experiment on the space station, they turn to their lawyer and he says, but boss, you haven't got any intellectual property protection. And he says, well, what about product liability? Well, boss, if something goes wrong, we might lose the entire company. And they go out and they say, okay, well, if I want to hire someone for a 3-month mission on space station and you're a European, well, the European Social Charter comes into play. That's 6 months on space station, that's 3 weeks guaranteed vacation, a 35-hour work week. There's little things that just don't quite make sense. So one thing I want you to think about tonight is when you leave this, is everything you hear, realize that we can change this. It's just the laws of man we have to change, laws that we've created ourselves. But I firmly believe, and we believe at our government, that that's the bottleneck. That's one of the big bottlenecks. That's what's stopping a lot of human activity in low Earth orbit and outer space. Free those bottlenecks, legally speaking, and that will give you a framework to allow further space activity. And again, as a banker's son, the bankers like a framework. They like a nice, safe place to go put their money. They don't like any legal doubts. But that's something that I hope places like the Baker Institute will start looking at. And I know they've looked very closely at export regulations, which are, again, hamstringing the industry. But again, it's a regulation. It's not in laws of physics that we've done this. We've done it to ourselves. But anything that we choose to do, and this great nation has shown the rest of the world, anything you choose to do, you can do. Whether it's having a revolution and leaving your former colonial partners back at home, and doing so quite successfully, all the way through to putting a man on the moon and sending robotic spacecraft to Jupiter, out of the solar system, doing amazing things with Hubble. So please keep inspiring the world, because we need you to do so. And maintain your leadership. It's not necessarily the budget issue, it's just a change of direction and a heart to do it. And with that, I'll sit down and blush for a lot.
Thank you, Chris. I very much appreciate the candor that our first two speakers have expressed, and I hope everybody will continue with that. Let me just mention that Chris touched on the export control issue, which some of you know about, some of you might not. It's an extremely serious matter for U.S. space industry. We had, George helped us put together some workshops here, bringing in people from industry who certainly understand firsthand what this is doing to U.S. industry. It's essentially destroying the U.S. satellite industry and perhaps even the launch industry, and it has major implications for what we can do on the space station and other ways in the future. It's a very, very serious policy issue, and it can be changed because it's not a law of physics. At least I don't think it's a law of physics. To see whether it is or not, let us turn to our provost, Gene Levy, for his comments.
Thank you. I'm actually really disappointed because George assured me that I would be the countercultural figure here. And the first speaker pushed me out of the place. I was going to say that on this panel I was feeling like a fish out of the water because although the title of the symposium, the title of the discussion is The Future of Human and Robotic Space Exploration, I had the feeling that despite the near equality of the billing of the speakers, that I was the token roboticist in the group. Rice University has a very strong commitment to diversity in all respects, and that I was going to be representing that aspect of diversity. This evening, my assessment was based on what I had read of the panelists and known of the panelists. It was also based on a personal experience I had with one of the panelists some years ago. Years ago, though he might not remember it, Lee Silver dragged me out of a committee meeting at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I don't remember what the committee was. I don't remember what we were talking about, but we were talking about human spaceflight and robotic spaceflight. And what provoked Lee to drag me out was his desire to improve my geological education as a means of convincing me of the importance of human beings, as I recall it. I have to admit, it was an intellectually scintillating experience, although I don't remember anything about it. But as I was dragged around the JPL campus, with Lee pointing out fascinating features in rocks and explaining what he would do to them given the chance, I gained a wholly expanded appreciation of the geologist's hammer, one that I did not have as a physicist growing up in my earlier career. What I did not get from that experience was converted. I'd like to spend a few minutes giving you my perspective on this evening's subject. As I said, I had intended to be the contrarian, but I'm now fearful that I could end up in the majority, but probably there isn't much danger of that. Nearly 20 years ago, while I was attending a meeting someplace, I don't remember where that was either, Jonathan Eberhardt tracked me down telephonically to a hotel room. Some of you may remember, Jonathan Eberhardt, who died last year, was a reporter for Science News, a truly outstanding science reporter for many years. From our previous encounters, Jonathan had developed the impression, perhaps erroneous, that public statements that I had made in the past and speeches were carefully thought through and pregnant with meaning on several levels. Jonathan first gained this impression covering and writing about a short speech that I had given during a conference at the Johnson Space Center, congratulating the Soviet delegation on the extraordinary success of their Venus lander mission in the early 1980s. And I at the time, was chairman of the Committee on Planetary and Lunar Exploration of the Space Science Board, and I was asked to give that speech. And in that speech, which was in fact given on many levels, I made many both implied and real comments about comparing what I had seen as the vision of the Soviet program at that time, which far exceeded the vision of the robotic program of the United States at that time. And Jonathan correctly read between all the lines, and so he gained this impression that it was the only time in my life I actually thought through what I was going to say. So Jonathan took the trouble to track me down so he could inquire about what hidden meaning there might be in a press release that NASA had recently published through the Ames Research Center in California. The NASA press release announced that I would lead an ambitious science project to develop a specialized telescope dedicated to the discovery of planetary systems. This was in 1984. Discovery of planetary systems rather than planets. What shocked Jonathan about the announcement was that the telescope was specifically being designed, and I had proposed it specifically, to be mounted on and operate from the space station. Jonathan started his questioning by pushing back at me the fact that I was widely known to be skeptical of the space station, indeed opposed to it. So why, Jonathan insisted on knowing, was I suddenly working to utilize the space station? Had I changed my mind, or what other hidden meaning was there in this, what he considered bizarre turn of events? My response was simple. No, I had not changed my mind. I still believed that from a scientific perspective, there was little, if any, strong rationale for the space station. I served on the National Academy panel that was asked by the White House by one of Neil's predecessors, Jay Keyworth, to write a report extolling the virtue of the space station for science. It didn't come out that way. But despite the fact that I felt there was little, if any, strong rationale for the space station, I felt nonetheless that the space station was going to happen for reasons having little to do with science, and that therefore it was incumbent upon those of us who might be able to capitalize on the capability to actually do something scientifically valuable with it, to actually do that. At the time, the space station was touted as a capacious, high-performance platform for ambitious scientific experiments at a project cost that was wholly unbelievable to any thinking person. The space station was touted as an $8 billion project in its first incarnation. In fact, $8 billion was spent before the first rivet was cast. My simple response, and so I was asked to confine my introductory remarks here to 10 minutes. So I'm not going to have time to describe the course of that project, including our unfolding discovery of just what a truly problematic challenge it would be to operate such a telescope on the space station, even in the ambitious original design incarnation that characterized the space station's what I'll call exuberant early years. Ultimately, it turned out that technically challenging science of the kind that we had proposed proved to be wholly unworkable in the space station in any stage of its development, either in the first early stage or in the less ambitious later stages. Although there is a wonderful painting of this 80-foot-long telescope that was produced by the NASA Ames Research Center. It's on the wall in the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory at the University of Arizona. The space age is now some half a century into its principal development, counting from the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Through that time, there have been two main lines of development: human spaceflight and scientific spaceflight. And I make that distinction. For science, the capabilities developed through spaceflight have been truly earth-shaking. The advance of knowledge, the understanding of new ideas, the overturning of our perceptions about the Earth, about the Sun, about the solar system, and about the universe constitute a veritable intellectual earthquake of major historical proportion. At the same time, the projection of human presence beyond the surface of the Earth, at least a few times as far as the Moon, is another development that I think all of us have to say is of truly historical and spectacular proportions. I have often thought that if one were to be able to look back from the perspective of 1,000 years in the future and ask what might be remembered about our time, probably the most likely memory would be of spaceflight, both of human spaceflight and robotic spaceflight. Having said that, I'm going to tell you, just to end these remarks, that I remain a skeptic of the human spaceflight program. And I want to impress upon you that the statement I'm going to make about it is not meant to criticize anybody or diminish the accomplishments of human spaceflight, diminish the courage, the heroism, or the sacrifice of any of the extraordinary participants in human spaceflight. And indeed, I have spent my entire adult life in admiration of our co-human beings who have participated in spaceflight. However, while space science has produced stunning advances of ever-increasing sophistication, importance, capability, and impact, illuminating answers to questions that have preoccupied human beings throughout history, in my view, the same cannot be said for human spaceflight. It seems to me that the problem is not necessarily inherent to human spaceflight. The problem is one of national policy, of purpose, priority, and commitment, including the willingness to spend the needed monies and the willingness to do those things within the context of a thoughtful national policy. I will say, however, I'm not the one who would advocate doing all of those things for reasons that we may come out in the conversation. Anyway, the purpose of these remarks was, I thought, to define our perspectives, and that is the perspective that I bring here, and I look forward to the conversation that doubtless will ensue.
Thank you very much, Gene, and for upholding the candor in our evening's discussions. So we'll see how Charlie Precourt does.
Thank you. Good evening. I think I'd rather just sit down over there and listen to the fascinating speakers who come up here. This is really neat and a great opportunity to be here with you this evening. I want to first echo what was said about some of the impediments to what we're doing in space. I have an office as a deputy manager for the space station program. I have an office that is engaged strictly in export control. An amusing little story that I ran into on a trip to Europe about 3 weeks ago. The Europeans are building an advanced transfer vehicle, which is a cargo ship that will deliver goods and services to the space station on behalf of the Europeans. And we, in cooperation, are providing certain services such as computers that come under export control. And our office that worked so hard to accelerate the transfer of equipment had written the appropriate paperwork to deliver computers to the French in the case of the computer integration for the vehicle. The computers went to southern France, to the Space Center there, for integration with the rest of their hardware, and then was shipped to Bremen, Germany, in the area where they were going to integrate the entire vehicle. Two different countries from our standpoint, but for the Europeans and the European Union now, they don't have any passport requirements in between countries over there. So what happened was the equipment went from France to Germany, and suddenly our paperwork was invalid. And I got to the factory floor where they were integrating the vehicle in Germany, and our computers that were the highlight of the entire avionics of this nice new rocket ship were not there because they had to be shipped back home. So we do, in fact, need to unload the burden of humans' laws to enable progress. I think we ought to take in perspective what I'd like to talk about a little bit here tonight to introduce things is where we've been that will have meaning for our future. Because I think as a human spaceflight participant, my dream has always been to see humans go to other parts of our solar system and eventually beyond, because I believe, as many of you might have heard from John Young, that it is about the survival of our species and making sure that we have some ability to survive when this planet can't house our species any further. So as I look at what we have in front of us, based on what we've learned so far, I think that there are about three things that we need to focus on to make sure that we enable future spaceflight. And I'd like to introduce those to you this evening. We are learning from space station in 2003 in the aftermath of the Columbia an immense amount about how to live and survive in space. And it has been an extremely challenging year. I'm spending this week negotiating with our Russian partners how we're going to use the remaining assets of their spacecraft to keep crew on the space station next year while we try to bring the shuttle back following the Columbia. The team is 100% focused on this objective, and we've been learning an immense amount. And as we think about what we're learning, not just the perseverance in the face of the Columbia tragedy, but the actual mechanical things we're learning about how to go further, there's three things that stick out very prominently. The first is propulsion and transportation. That is the most expensive part about going to space. It's getting out of the gravity well, getting off the surface of this planet. And then it's once you're there, how to survive requires an immense amount of power. Humans consume, and that's why robotics has an immense advantage, is that there's not as much consumption. And then the third is to protect the human being when they are there, because it is a very hostile environment. From the perspective of the first problem, which is transportation and propulsion to get to and from space, the most challenging part is to get to orbit, because that's where our gravity challenge is the greatest. And in the wake of the Columbia disaster, I think you've heard in the debates that are going around the country that we should abandon, as much as abandon the shuttle or winged vehicles, find a replacement for the shuttle, move back to more simple spacecraft like capsules of the old days, and think about things like separating cargo from the humans and use smaller separate vehicles. And I would think that it would be best to step back a little bit before we conclude too much from one situation, that is the loss of the Columbia, and ask ourselves, what do we really see as a vision in the future way down the road? First and foremost, NASA has a charter to develop technologies that no one else can. And in looking at what we've done with the shuttle, it is the only winged vehicle that has been able to bring humans and cargo to and from orbit. If you take a look at the Apollo program, it was a 7.5 million pound vehicle at liftoff, and when the mission was over, it was a 10,000 pound capsule that could not get used again. If you take a look at what the shuttle does, it's a 5 million pound vehicle, which is significantly less, and when it returns, a 250,000 pound orbiter that has a capacity for 40,000 pounds of cargo up and down comes back and gets reused again, on top of the fact that much of the propulsion system in the boosters is also reusable again. It's an immense leap in capabilities. And if you think about that in terms of our charter to develop what no one else can and how we might apply that in the future, if there is to be one day a vibrant business for humans in space, there will be many people going to and from space on a regular basis. I don't envision that we would want them to go to and from space in capsules that come down under parachutes in the field somewhere that need to be retrieved, but in fact we would envision them being able to go to and from spaceports with runways and access that is much more convenient for humans to make massive amounts of transfers to and from orbit. Once they're in orbit, the idea would be to transition to other kinds of spacecraft to go further into other destinations in orbit. So we should step back and make sure we think clearly about designs to replace the shuttle, instead of immediately thinking that it has failed and is therefore no longer useful to us. We should make sure we capture the great attributes it has and integrate that into future designs. With respect to propulsion, the problem with going into deep space is that all of our spacecraft to date, when they end up in orbit, they shut down their engines and coast. And it takes months to go to Mars under that kind of system. At the Johnson Space Center today, we have a small group studying a propulsion system that is led by Dr. Franklin Chang-Diaz, an astronaut that has flown 6 times in space, a very prolific career. And he's developing what we call the Variable Specific Impulse Magnetoplasma Rocket. And for that being a mouthful, we call it VASIMIR for short. And it is a lot like a microwave oven, where you take fuel and you move it into the oven and you heat it, superheat it to very, very high temperatures. He's succeeded in over 1 million degrees in the laboratory heating his fuel. And then when it gets high enough energy, you steer it out the back end of the microwave oven with a magnetic nozzle, and it becomes thrust. And it sips fuel at such a low rate because it's heated to such high energies that you can produce thrust all the way to Mars. And instead of having a 500-day mission, you have on the order of 60 days. An incredible change in technology if we can capture it. It is power hungry, like I just mentioned. Power is the capacity to provide for humans once in space. So we need to provide the electrical power on the order of megawatts to enable that kind of propulsion system. So along with that will need to be a development of nuclear energy to travel in space, because humans are energy consumers in a great degree. Finally, the capacity to move deeper into space and explore will depend on our abilities to protect the human. And the challenges we have to date are things like the degeneration of the human body due to weightlessness, exposure to radiation that causes illnesses. In both those cases, we are learning an immense amount on the space station. In the last 2 missions, I'm happy to report that what we thought for many, many years was a requirement to do aerobic exercise with treadmills and ergometer bicycles that are very complex to operate in space and machine and hardware intensive. We're learning that physical resistance exercise, in fact, can protect the human's bones from degenerating much more effectively. It's anecdotal to this point, but we've had 2 crew members now come back with 0 bone loss after 6 months in space. We've never been able to do that before. So now we are learning to have the capacity to live out there longer. On top of that, we know that radiation is a huge problem, but this same rocket design that Franklin Chang Diaz is proposing would envision the fuel tanks being installed around the crew compartment, and the fuel that is used would be based of low molecular weight materials that absorb radiation. And if you were to envision a hydrogen slush in the fuel tanks, you can absorb the majority of radiation that the humans would be exposed to. So suddenly you start to enable things that we thought before were impossible. I'm not a scientist, so I can't speak to whether there was scientific justification for a space station. I hope that there will be proof of that as we go down the road. I've mentioned a couple of things we've learned. I'm going to partner with my good friend Volodya Titov here in a minute to show you what I think another benefit of space station and human spaceflight is, in our ability to cooperate as partners when we were previously enemies. It's very, very important to learn to work together, and he and I are going to partner here in a little bit to provide you some entertainment. But there's one little final story I'll leave you with, and it will demonstrate one of the values of a space station and human spaceflight. I'll leave you with a story, though. When I think about space station, I think about a resource such as a national laboratory. We have the Sandia National Labs, Bell Labs, and so forth. And every once in a while around the country, you'll open the paper and you'll read that at Sandia National Labs, such and such was discovered today and a new breakthrough is expected, so on and so forth. We should be hearing about that from human endeavors everywhere, whether it be on the planet in a laboratory or in space in a laboratory. And there's no doubt that the questions that we have to answer and the constraints we have to live under as we live in space force us to learn things that are directly applicable. And I'll sit down and be quiet here in just a minute, but I want to give you this thing that we just discovered this week. A doctor from the Detroit area who is an investigator in ultrasound technologies that will be used on the space station came and talked to us at the program office and was very, very excited because we gave them a constraint that they were supposed to go figure out how to diagnose medical problems in astronauts on orbit, and he couldn't have an X-ray machine, he couldn't have an MRI, he couldn't have a CAT scan. All that stuff is very, very, very prohibitive to be taken to space. But what we do have is a suitcase-sized little ultrasound device, and beyond letting you know whether the baby is a boy or a girl, or whether or not your heart has a problem, or you have a kidney stone, what can we do with this thing? So he said, okay, I'm going to go work on that. And can I diagnose a collapsed lung in case a crew member has a problem during EVA? Can I diagnose a broken bone? Can I look at things internal to the other organs? And lo and behold, he went to several trauma centers, and he started in parallel doing diagnostics with the ultrasound machine. And they now can diagnose over 600 different maladies with ultrasound that had never been determined for its use in the past, to the point that the trauma center in Detroit has now gotten rid of the use of X-ray and MRI in the emergency room for several diagnostics that required those machines because they find the ultrasound that much more beneficial. And the Detroit Red Wings hockey team has one right on the sidelines, so that if a player is injured in the game, they bring out the ultrasound. They don't have to haul him in an ambulance downtown to the MRI center. They diagnose it right there. So we are very proud when things like that happen. The point is that when we stretch ourselves out into a new environment, we learn and we apply that knowledge. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you tonight.
Thank you very much, Charlie. You do remind me, there were times, I remember several times in the White House when I was working with OMB folks. President's Office of Management and Budget, whatever the administration is, has got lots of people in it, good people, but their job is to hammer the budgets down. And more often than not, I got told how expensive it was to fly the shuttle versus how cheap it is to launch a satellite on what we call an expendable launch vehicle. And so why don't we put the astronauts on the top of these vehicles? And so we went through all that. So first of all, U.S. no longer has a rocket like we did in Apollo days. Russia does. We have no way to lift heavy material, people, and supplies other than the shuttle. But of course, the other point is it is different putting humans in space. I mean, you must do things to lower the probability of accident. Anyway, you did. Thank you for reminding me of those many occasions. Now we're going to hear from the guy that taught geology to our provost, Lee Silverman. Lee, please.
I may have also given a lecture or two to Charles and to the general, but I can't remember anymore. Because I'm an old geezer and I don't remember things that I should remember, especially when I want to remember. But I have been stimulated, even provoked, when it turns out that in the home of manned spaceflight, I'm the guy who stands alone. Now let me remind you about my background. I retired after many years. I first came to Caltech in 1948. You can figure it out. I've been to Caltech since JPL was being born. And JPL is certainly one of the major, mechanisms for robotic flight, as you call it. I don't like the word robotic flight, George. It's men conducting experiments by robotic means, but it's not robotic experiments. I'm a specialist in education, and for a brief 3 or 4 years, I had the pleasure of working with the astronauts. And I would use them as well as a few other names to tell you that there are no limits to the capability of man. There are limits to what you can make a robot do. And if you don't face up to that, then you will never learn the most fundamental secrets about our solar system, about planetary systems in any solar system, unless you're willing to develop a culture in which the ability of an informed man to see the connections, to appreciate the principles, and to weave them all together into the kind of most fundamental story which will bear on our origins, which will bear on the Earth's origins, the solar system's origins, and what have you. And you guys, I can only say one thing to you. O ye of little faith. And I say that not mockingly or without respect, because I've heard so many good things in the course of the talk, almost all of which I can agree with, except for the statement that you can only do it with robots. I've never seen a design of a robot who could do complex thinking, who could integrate a large body of data. Forget the memory bank. Forget the various programmed processes in the computer. It's understanding that we're striving for. And I had the privilege of working with a number of crews. And you had the privilege of listening to one of those crew members, a really outstanding one, John Young, who I got to know on several occasions. He was in the backup team of the Apollo 13 crew, with which I worked some length, but never got to land. And then I met him again as the commander of Apollo 16. And if you heard him, you were probably introduced to the incredible flight record that he has and his ability to withstand catastrophe. The catastrophe I saw, which most of you won't think much of, was when John backed away from a tape of 24 connections tied to a drill he had just used to sink a sampler down into the crust, and he accidentally tore it. And because I had known John before, because I know him again, to watch his recovery from what was a catastrophe, one of the most important objectives in his mission, he just faced up to it like a man. And that's the word I want to use, man. Now let me talk about John Young. Maybe you detected this when he was here. I wasn't here when he gave his talk. But John has incredible intelligence. He has fantastic physical coordination. He's a great pilot. Colonel, wouldn't you? I mean, great pilot. But he has something else that no other astronaut I've seen has matched. He has a passion for the exploration of space. And I'm going to tell you that aside from intelligence and many other things, really great work is done by men with passion. And you all know I'm right, because you've seen those men, and you hope you have your proper share of passion in what you do. Even a dean, you understand, or a university president has to have some passion. But I have to make this... I understand. I understand. But the great achievements that I'm familiar with in the history of science are invariably driven by a genuine passion to try to understand. And I'll cite one example for you. It's kind of immediate with me. My wife has a job which will take her to Chile in a month. And because I'm her spouse, I get to go, okay? Well, I've always wanted to go to Chile because there is a wonderful book called The Voyage of the Beagle. Now, all of you know The Voyage of the Beagle. Probably the most famous man in the history of animal and plant evolution is Charles Darwin. The captain of the Beagle was an English gentleman by the name of Fitzroy, and he was afraid that he'd be on a 4-year expedition and he wouldn't have anybody he could talk to. He was allowed by the Admiralty to take on board a young man by the name of Charles Darwin. Charles was a geologist. Get that word, geologist. Okay. Better than that, he was a naturalist of his time. This is 1831 to 1835. And Charles, through the most astute observations, but more importantly, through the most penetrating questions, which only the human mind could have asked, arrived at a set of conclusions which has influenced us more than the space program, if you really think about the importance of his contributions to the concepts of animal evolution. But he was a thinking man. He had a great captain with whom he could discuss this stuff. In fact, the captain tried to beat his own publication of the results of this 4-year expedition with the captain's version of their joint conversations and interactions. He wasn't being ugly or unfair, but that's the way it came out. Poor Charles Darwin. He had only one good break. He married the heiress to the Wedgwood porcelain fortune. Okay? And he retired to a country home in the state where he thought about what he had seen on the 4-year trip. It took him many years to get his conclusions together. And he was urged by his friends, including all the great British scientists of the time, to get them down on paper, because they'd all been fascinated. They'd heard him give papers and what have you. And he finally did, because another thinking man, a guy by the name of Wallace, was coming to the same conclusions. but did not have the immense body of data which Darwin had accumulated in those 4 years, and which he'd kept supplementing or augmenting with what he was reading about what was going on in the world. Darwin thought his way through with the most careful documentation. You have to start by reading The Voyage of the Beagle to see the man in operation, and then you have to read The Origin of the Species to put it all together, and you can see what the human mind is capable of. Now, when I worked with the astronauts, and Neil, I got a problem. I can't tell time, so you have to shut me off when I have to be shut off. But I'm full of, okay, I'm full of my subject right now because I feel really that you don't understand the capacity of intelligent men, strongly motivated, that's where the passion comes into it, to work towards a new insight, a new understanding. Yet every one of the great astronauts I met had been through a test pilot school or advanced test pilot school. And what was their job? In times of crisis, to make observations which would help understand what had happened. And they were asked to synthesize. Now, you all are a coterie of very intelligent scientists and engineers, but I'm a geologist. And I'm about to make that observation to you. As a geologist, I have to do a synthesis with almost any project I do. I'm also a data gatherer. I ran an isotope laboratory for 40 years, okay? Making the measurements wasn't my objective. Arriving at a new level of understanding was my objective. And building what other people had learned, to which I could add what I had learned, and creating a better story, or the best story, I never got to that, you understand, was what I was after. I know from watching the responses of about 15 postdoctoral fellows, about 20 PhDs that I've worked with, you understand, that the human mind, properly motivated, adequately equipped, working in an environment with the support that's necessary to survive, Caltech's pretty tough. I wasn't talking about space or anything. These guys do wonderful things. There are no limits to what they can do. Do not think of this as an engineer's job. For whom I'm a civil engineer. Okay, I'm a licensed engineer. It's a great job. I'm thinking about creative science. The most important questions we'll deal with in space have to do with creating a better understanding of the physical environment. I'm going to say to you that I had a lot of other messages to give you, but I had the most wonderful experience working with Apollo astronauts. They are so intelligent. They're as good or better than most of my grad students, you understand? Despite the fact that I worked with my grad students for years, these guys I didn't have that much time with, but their inherent understanding was there. What grabbed them, if anything, was the ability to recognize the problem that we were going to address on their mission and the license with which we were able to give them to do something about it. So if I talk about John Young or Dave Scott or Jim Irwin, God bless him, wherever he is, you understand, these are marvelous men. You don't know what men can do unless you've worked with them trying to come up to the crises questions. And they approach that with their intelligence, their instincts, their passion. And so I have to disagree with a large part of what was said here a little while ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. I think we're staying high on the candor meter, and I appreciate that very much. Now, I don't know what we're in for with Vladimir Titov and the show, so but I would like to welcome you to the podium to tell us what is on your mind. Thank you.
Okay, I prepared the presentation for at least for 20 minutes, but not worried, I will be much shorter. And I asked Charlie Precourt to help me with translation, and it will be maybe faster.
This is the entertainment part, because he's going to do this. He's going to do this in Russian, and I'm going to give it to you in English.
Yeah, and I would like to ask the first chart of my presentation, technical people. Yeah, I switch the language. Мы перейдем более к техническому проекту будущего.
We're going to talk about a more technical level of projects in the future.
Уже 60-х годов
Already in the 1960s,
ракетно-космическая корпорация «Энергия»,
the Energia Corporation,
которая делала корабли «Восток» и первый корабль для
the one that
Гагарина,
built the first spacecraft of Gagarin called the
уже
Vostok.
тогда она начала думать о марсианском проекте.
Already then had already talked about and thought about projects to Mars.
Все это начиналось с корабля, который был построен на базе ядерного реактора и ядерных
Already we
двигателей.
had a nuclear-based reactor for nuclear. Are you not hearing me?
Well, get close to my.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Already they were thinking about nuclear reactor-based energy for engines to fly to Mars.
И с высадкой 5 модулей, которые соединялись в поезд и путешествовали по Марсу.
And then you had 5 or so modules that would be strung together like a train and then would go to Mars.
Но время шло, и концепции менялись.
And then the time went by and the
Уже в
concept changed.
конце 69-х годов количество модулей сократилось до 1.
And then in the late 60s and 70s, when the concept changed, we had gone from many modules down to 1.
И уже в 80-е годы, когда пришли новые двигатели, электрореактивные двигатели,
And then in the 80s, when we found the appearance of new engines, such as electric ion engines,
и новые электростанции на солнечной энергии,
and new stations on solar power,
концепция совершенно изменилась.
and the concepts really changed.
Что главное в концепции? Выбор двигателей.
What's the main thing about a concept is to choose an engine.
Выбор первого сценария полета.
Figure out the first scenario or concept for the flight.
И выбор ракеты-носителя, который будет выводить составные части корабля на орбиту Земли.
And choose the rocket carrier or launcher that will take the modules into Earth orbit.
Not working.
Uh-oh.
Next chart. I don't know, maybe this is not working for next chart. Okay. Okay. Ага. Жидкостно-реактивные двигатели.
They had fluid reactive propulsion engines,
Хорошо отработанные, но малоэффективные.
but they worked very well but had low efficiency.
Требуют большой запас топлива, это значит тяжелый корабль.
So you had to have lots of fuel, big mass, and it means a very, very heavy spacecraft.
И неприемлемый уровень надежности для возврата экипажа на Землю.
And also a difficult problem with the reliability to bring the crew back to Earth.
Ядерные реактивные двигатели.
And then you have the nuclear-based,
Меньшая масса,
less mass,
большая энергия,
lots of energy.
но чтобы отработать эти двигатели на Земле, вы понимаете, большая проблема, так как струя реактивных двигателей.
So you have a problem though, with this kind of an engine working on the Earth with the radiation and the energy that you have to handle, obviously, is very dangerous.
И струя, да, радиоактивна слишком. Следующий этап. Появились фотоэлементы, которые преобразуют солнечную энергию в
So
электричество.
then we come up with the idea of photoelectric cells that could take advantage of the sun's energy to create electricity.
Появились электрореактивные двигатели.
So we have electrical generated engines,
И концепция начала меняться.
and then the concept started to change.
И к концу 80-х годов российская сторона пришла к такому выводу, что основной концепцией российской проекта полета на Марс является
And then at the end of the 80s, the Russians came up with the idea that the concept for flight to Mars would be
это однокорабельный десантный сценарий,
it'd be one spacecraft type of scenario,
использование электрореактивных двигателей
using electrical ion engine types of propulsion,
и использование фотоэлементов для добывания электроэнергии.
and then to use photoelectric cells to generate electrical power for the propulsion.
Какую ракету выбрать для сборки корабля на орбите?
And what kind of rocket would you want to choose for building and assembling the mechanism on orbit?
История знает, что на сегодняшний день таких типа ракет две.
And history will show that type of rocket today
Это
is two types.
Это Сатурн-5
There was Saturn V
и энергия,
and the Energia rocket, which is a Russian
который выводит
high-
порядка 80-100 тонн на орбиту.
which was able to deliver 100 tons on
По
orbit.
расчетам проектантов, нужно 6 таких запусков для постройки такого корабля.
And they could calculated that they would need 6 types of launches of that size to be able to construct a rocket to move to Mars.
Теперь корабль.
Now we'll talk about the spacecraft.
Да.
Now we're talking about the craft itself for interplanetary travel to Mars.
Итак, корабль и огромные солнечные батареи.
You have the spacecraft and a huge solar panel.
Каким образом это все будет монтироваться на орбите?
And how would all this be put together in orbit?
Специальным экипажем,
A special crew,
который будет все эти элементы собирать на орбите.
which would take all these elements together in orbit.
Главным элементом, конечно же, является жилой модуль.
And so the hard core of the module itself, where they live, is the major element of this spacecraft.
В проекте наших проектантов такой модуль должен весить примерно 70 тонн.
And they figure that this was going to be 70 tons of an approximate weight requirement.
Это примерно в 3,5 раза больше, чем станция «Мир», которая вот летала.
It's about 3.5 times the size of the Mir that flew.
Все системы, которым обладали станции, которые обладает Международная космическая станция на орбите сейчас, остаются и здесь.
And all the systems for things like life support that you see on the space station today remain here.
Добавляется резервирование,
You have reserves and
добавляется специальный отсек противорадиационной защиты,
you have to add things like special reserves and protection from radiation that we don't necessarily have on the
чтобы
station.
защитить экипаж от радиационных слоев вокруг Земли и космического излучения.
So then you have to add things to protect the crew from radiation in the outer areas of the belts around the Earth and then into deep space where radiation doesn't exist or exists at greater levels than for crews in low Earth orbit.
Это один из вариантов, рабочих вариантов проекта.
This is one of the working examples of the project.
Спускаемый и взлетно-посадочный аппарат.
So now we need to talk about the descent vehicle and landing capabilities.
Это смотрится таким образом, что часть экипажа будет находиться на орбите Марса,
And then we'd have the idea that a part of the crew would be in orbit around
а
Mars.
часть экипажа будет находиться во взлетном модуле спускаемого аппарата.
And then another part would be in a flying descent module to
С
go.
тем, чтобы в случае аварийной обстановки экипаж мог бы вернуться на орбиту.
And so that if there was a problem, an emergency, the crew would have a place to go back to orbit to rejoin the main craft, much like we did for the moon.
Да. Значит, мы немножко коснулись, каким образом собирается корабль. Этапы примерно выглядят таким образом.
And this is just schematics that show the kind of steps that would be done to put the craft together.
Программа полета.
This is the flight program, the flight plan, if you will.
Корабль собирается на орбите вокруг Земли.
Up in the left, you have step one. You
Затем-
assemble it in orbit around the Earth.
Затем по спирали он увеличивает высоту своей
Then
орбиты,
you take a
переходит
spiral orbit to increase its altitude,
и выходит на траекторию полета к
to
Марсу.
exit the Earth's gravity well to get into a trajectory.
Также по спирали он снижает высоту вокруг Марса.
And then it descends its altitude by spiral around Mars.
Производится отделение спускаемого и возвратного аппаратов.
And then you have to separate the descent and return capsule,
Спуск на Марс.
the descent onto Mars,
Работа на Марсе от 10 до 20 дней.
and about 10 to 20 days on the surface for work.
Возврат на корабль.
The returns craft,
И такой же схемой возврат на орбиту Земли.
and a return to Earth orbit, about the same scheme that we saw for going out.
Защита экипажа.
Okay, now we're going to talk about protecting the crew.
Конечно же, это очень большая проблема, которая требует еще дальнейшей проработки.
So that certainly is a big problem that requires a lot of additional work for us in the future.
Но, естественно, сначала нужны будут автоматы,
So we have to do things
нужны
automatically.
будут роботы
We need robots
и нужны будут автоматические исследования поверхности Марса.
and robotic or remote controlled
С последующим-
research of the surface
С
of Mars.
последующим переходом к пилотируемому полету.
And then we can move on once we've learned enough to human space flights into this environment.
Особенности концепции.
Here are the peculiarities of this particular
Высокая,
concept.
высокая вероятность благополучного возвращения экипажа.
So you have a very high probability to get the crew back. That's pretty impressive.
Стоимость экспедиции
The
Да.
cost of the mission
А это двигатели и солнечная энергия.
It's the engines and the solar power systems.
Это самая надежная система из существующих на сегодняшний день.
That's what makes this reliable, is having that kind of scheme.
Стоимость экспедиции по предварительным оценкам представляется минимальной.
The cost to do this is minimized as compared to other concepts.
Складывается она из стоимости двигателей, стоимости энергии.
And the biggest costs are the energy and the engines to do the mission.
Использование электрореактивных двигателей позволяет делать корабль многоразовым.
The electric-based engines allow for this kind of
Это тоже
development,
снижение стоимости.
and it lowers the costs.
Программа полета летной отработки взлетно-посадочного корабля выполняется в автоматическом варианте.
And all of the major evolutions that happen in the flight plan would use automatic types of machines to accomplish descent and return and things of that nature.
И высокая технологичность, средства, созданные для организации экспедиции на Марс, также могут применяться и на Земле. Высокая технологичность нового проекта.
The high technologies of a new project.
Например, на базе фотоэлементов могут быть создан буксир, который будет доставлять грузы, например, от Земли до Луны.
Yeah, we'd be able to use these things as spin-offs for other areas, like taking things to the moon or for other projects.
И такой вариант также экологически чист.
And it's ecologically safe and clean to use this particular
Я
variant.
думаю, что это тоже у людей планеты вызовет положительные эмоции.
And this is a benefit for those on the Earth that would be reviewing this kind of
Такой корабль
concept.
по замыслу проектантов должен быть создан примерно с расчетом, чтобы он работал 15 лет.
And this kind of machine ought to be created with the idea that it has a resource of 15 years capacity.
Полет на Марс и обратно занимает 2 года.
And this kind of a flight to Mars and back with this concept would take 2 years.
Нет смысла строить новый корабль, потому что этот зарекомендует, мы надеемся, себя положительно.
And it's not worth it to build new spacecraft for this because of the type of mission you're on.
Его оснастить новыми продуктами, изменить какие-то системы, и он готов к следующему полету.
So we would want to use something that's reusable, such that when you repeated the mission, you could just rebuild what you started from and not have to do things all over from scratch.
Что сделано на сегодняшний день, как бы историческая веха?
So what have we done up to today with historical application to what we were envisioning?
У нас есть ракеты.
We have rockets.
Мы знаем, как строить космические корабли.
We know how to build a spacecraft.
Мы знаем, как строить фермы и как строить солнечные батареи.
We can build trusses and structures for solar panels.
Имеются электрические двигатели, которые уже опробованы в космосе на реальных объектах.
We have electric ion engines that can work and operate in space.
На космических станциях экипажи работают уже больше года.
We've already had crews that have lived and worked
Это,
on
как
space
говорится,
stations for more than a year.
Нон-стоп.
Yeah, and continuous more than a year.
Системы управления и навигации отработаны.
We've already worked out navigation control systems.
Системы повторного использования кислорода, удаления вредных примесей, удаления СО2 отработаны.
The systems that would be required to remove carbon dioxide, to remove hazardous chemicals from the air, things of that nature that support the crew have already been worked out with reliability.
Отработ замкнутый цикл систем по воде.
And we have a closed-loop system for water,
Экипаж может использовать воду многократно.
and we can use water multiple times over and over again because it's closed-loop.
Система электролиза воды позволяет из воды добывать кислород.
And from the water we can produce oxygen,
Все эти системы работали и работают на летающей станции.
and all these kinds of systems to support humans are already working on the space station.
Замкнутый цикл по пище считается неприемлемой для полета на Марс.
And the problem that we have is this food products is not the way we do food today is not really convenient for flight to Mars.
Поэтому в этой концепции предусматривается подготовить достаточный запас продуктов на 2 года.
So you would have to build in the reserves for enough food for 2 years and get it there.
Однако может быть рекомендовано использовать для различных оранжерей для выращивания вот таких.
However, you could envision being able to do greenhouses that would allow you to produce food en route.
Ну и как финальную часть можно сказать, что таким образом все отработано и, в общем-то, к полету на Марс человечество готово.
And so to end here, to finish up, what we could say is all of the elements necessary have been worked out, and in principle, humans are ready for flight to Mars.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much. That was a workout for me, and that was very enjoyable, but I think what I was trying to talk about a little bit ago was a demonstration of somebody who flew MiG-21s in the Cold War working side by side with someone who flew F-15s in Germany in the Cold War, and it's just a great thing that we're doing together, and I enjoy the heck out of it.
Thank you very much, Vladimir and Charlie, for a wonderful demonstration of U.S.-Russian partnership. It was terrific Russian. It was great translation. And many of us, thank you. Of course, many of the audience probably didn't need the translation, but still it was much appreciated. So now we come to question time. And let me just start with a softball question. Should we fly the shuttle again? Absolutely. If so, why? If not, what do we lose? Anybody want to comment on that?
Sure. We've got to fly the shuttle again. We
gotta
have,
fly it, please.
I think we have no option because we're years away from a replacement, and we cannot afford to take the time between now and whenever that replacement vehicle is produced. It's time wasted, time lost in our exploration of space.
Could I ask it just sort of along that lines? You know, there was a lot of criticism to U.S.-Russia cooperation. There was a lot of criticism in the U.S. Congress by people I won't name, just in the spirit of good taste this evening, of having Russia on the critical path, the space station. How would we have dealt with the situation after Columbia had we not had that partnership with Russia? Any comment?
I'm living that right now, and it would have been absolutely impossible. When Columbia happened, we made a prediction that we had enough resources to last about 6 months. We're now over a year, or approaching a year, I should say, and we can make it through 2004, barring any unforeseen further problems without the shuttle, thanks to our Russian partners' capacity.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on any of that? Let me ask about a vision for NASA. I fully agree with comments that were made that we find ourselves, and have for some time, I think, in the difficult situation of not having a clearly identified vision, to use a different word, for our space program, broadly conceived, how the different parts fit together. And I think we don't have that right now. What should it be? What should be that vision? What should we be saying tomorrow? What should the president say? Lee, I want to start with you.
I just want to say that when you talk about developing a vision, if that vision is going to be constrained by pragmatic considerations, which are always there, which will never go away, then the vision you'll develop is going to be much more limited than to really state the broadest and most focused vision on fundamental questions which man wants to get answers to. So I want to see us not confuse vision with a plan. And the plan is invariably involved with the pragmatic sides of the question. But I want to hear about visions which are really high-flown.
We're confused. And we have allowed ourselves to fall into the belief that NASA, an organization, needs to have NASA does not need to exist for us to go forward from today. NASA came about for a very good reason, I suppose. It was the way that we focused our efforts to explore space. It may be that, and this may be heresy, but it may be that NASA needs to go away to get rid of the baggage, and we need to come up with another organization that will allow us to go where we all know we need to go. I personally believe we need to go to Mars. That is not the ultimate, by the way. We've got to get to Mars because that's where we can spend some time determining whether or not there is an alternative place where humans can survive. Once we get there, and I think that's, I'm cheating because I read Florida Today and a lot of other people, smart people who do a lot of thinking about this kind of stuff. But I mean, they sat down and laid out a 50-year plan to get to Mars. And at the end of that 50 years, guess what they come up with? Develop a long-range plan. So, you got to go somewhere where we can start planning. We're out of Schlitz here. We've exercised, I think, as much planning as we can about long-term survival on Earth. I hope that God is kind to us and He allows us to live here for several more millennia. But should that not be the case and we want to survive as a human species, I join hopefully my friend, Dr. Levy.
We'll see after you finish talking.
and we combine robotic exploration or the exploration with machines controlled by man from Earth to determine what limits man can go right now. And I use man as a generic term. And then we go there and we go step by step. Right now, Mars is where we want to go because all of us in this room, I think, agree that that's a place that we think if there's any place in this solar system or in the universe as we know it, we can survive. Once we get there 50 years from now and live there for a while and demonstrate that we can survive there, then we build a plan that says, okay, now where do we want to go? Because I would have never thought we'd have been sitting in this room. To be quite honest with you, when I came to NASA at Johnson Space Center in 1980, I would have never dreamed that we would have been sitting in this room here on Earth having this discussion. I thought I would have been sitting on the surface of the moon or perhaps pretty close to going to Mars. And I don't think I'm foolhardy in my thinking. That's why I joined the space program, because I really thought that by this time we would be somewhere else other than in an earthbound environment having this discussion. And that's why I'm disappointed, to be quite honest.
I'd like to add one thing. Charlie just got me to thinking about the NASA organization. Is it right for this kind of vision? It seems to me that the vision provides focus, and when we did Apollo, the NASA and the nation was focused on an objective, and over time I think we've been trying to do too much for too many. With what is left of our space exploration initiatives, we end up trying to solve problems for so many congressional districts and put parts of our programs into the interests of lots of different programs that lack focus like a new vision could give us. So there may be something to what he's saying there.
But may I just add an unsolicited sort of comment that one thing that struck me as I began to work with NASA is how extraordinarily difficult it is for the administrator, any administrator of NASA, to sort of say, I'm going to manage this NASA, this organization better. I'm going to spend my money wiser. I'm going to move things around. I mean, the minute you talk about reallocating $1 from one congressional district to another congressional district, the phone starts to ring from all sorts of people who you have to pay attention to. It's foolish to hear politicians talking about, well, the whole problem is that the agency, any agency, actually for that matter, is just not managing its resources right. I mean, who keeps that from happening? It's not the bureaucrats in the agencies, and I mean bureaucrats in the most positive term here. To a large extent, it's nobody's fault. It's our political system, where we have a representational form of government that puts a lot of power in the Congress, which is representative of constituents, and they feel responsible for that. So you just try to manage an agency different from that. I won't ask anybody to comment on that. That was an unsolicited, nonpartisan kind of statement about our government, which is indeed best country in the world, best form of government. But it does have these little challenges along the way. Suppose we weren't going to go back to space with human beings or stay the course. Suppose we're going to put all our eggs in robotics. I think I know where Dr. Silver is on this, but what should we do? What's the most important thing to do using non-manned, non-human exploration of space that maybe we're not currently doing? Chris wants to make a comment, and then I'd like Gene to make a comment.
Well, I hope this doesn't sound too facetious, but I'd start learning Mandarin or learn to speak Hindu very quickly. Because they will push ahead, they will take the high ground, and we will become a technologically backward former civilization. And, I mean, that's the blunt truth. I know we're getting into a debate about robotics, or yes, or humans no, but if we don't do it, the laws of physics don't care what language you speak. They work for everybody. And America's paved the way, Russia's paved the way. We'll get left behind. Without human spaceflight, you know, my son, Roman, he won't have a future.
Gene, you agree?
I don't agree with that at all, but let's. And so I hardly know where to begin. It is not at all clear to me that the future of the human species, the future of technology, the future of leadership, technological and other leadership on the Earth, is tied to human spaceflight. I mean, human spaceflight played a very important role 40 years ago for international relations purposes, for projecting a sense of leadership, for finding a benign way to demonstrate to the Russians that we could put a hydrogen bomb in Red Square without actually having to put one there, during a time when there were allegations being made of missile gaps and performance gaps and bomb gaps. But it seems to me that the leadership on the Earth is ultimately a projection of social values, of economic power, of technological power. In fact, most of the benefits of that kind that have come to the human species have come through non-human presence in space. I mean, all of the economic activity that you pointed to a little while ago that have strengthened our activity on the surface of the planet have come from non-human activity in space, and I don't see as sexy and emotionally exciting, and I am as emotionally excited about it as anybody else, as human space flight is. I don't see that the fallout is anything like what you described, either for doing it or for not doing it. But let me come to the question and to the question. The answer to your question, interestingly, I'm going to give the same answer that my friend here gave. I'm still your friend. And that I would argue that the most pressing thing for us to be doing in terms of exploring the solar system is to go to Mars. To go to Mars because it is a planet that poses in the aggregate the most interesting and challenging and fundamental set of questions as they pertain to, as questions pertain to the presence of living organisms on the surface of a planet. And I think that's something that has a resonance both intellectually and emotionally with us that we should not ignore. And so, in fact, I've argued for years that the NASA program ought really focus on Mars. My view is that we ought to be focusing on Mars robotically. And to disagree with my colleague at the end of the table, it is not that we're seeking to have the robots do the interpretation. I mean, this is a human activity. The only difference in our perspectives is how we get the data. Ultimately, every aspect of space exploration, whether it be with machines or whether it be with human beings, is, as you said yourself, a projection of the human mind. And I don't think there can be any disagreement about that around the table or along the table. The other thing that I think we should not neglect, and we have tended to focus in this conversation predominantly on those things that would be either done by human beings or done by machines. And so that tends to focus the conversation on exploration of the planets, travel throughout the solar system. It is clear that the human spirit, the mind, the intellect, have been as elevated by the astronomical accomplishments in space as by anything that's happened in the century. I mean, and so I'd argue that it is critical for us to, as we think about exploring the solar system, to recognize that we have truly extraordinary things to accomplish, truly extraordinary vistas of human imagination to illuminate, and questions to answer that speak to the issues that have been on people's minds since the dawn of civilization and intelligence. about the history of the universe, the nature of our presence here, from that from which we emerged as a human species on the surface of this planet. So while I think that a Mars focus, in my view, a robotic, intensive robotic exploration of Mars, internationally prosecuted, it ought to be a main part of the program. We have a lot of very other important things to do in science and in space, telescopically and in other ways.
Taking the other point of view that human spaceflight is going to continue to be a priority in the country, should this continue to be an international activity, and should that international community expand? I have in mind the Chinese effort, for example. So what is your thought about cooperation with sort of all nations who have a capability to put humans in space? Are there limitations? I mean, is it a policy issue that some could speak to that some don't wish to speak to?
There probably is one point of absolute total agreement around this table, and that is the bizarre nature and impact of the export-import controls that we were talking about before, and I think that and not just in space exploration, but in every human activity. I mean, it's bizarre, it's unenlightened, and it also projects the notion that if we don't do something, nobody else is going to do it. So this bizarre notion that somehow we have more synaptic capability in the United States than the rest of the world combined. And so we have to get past this paranoia. But having said that, it seems to me that there is no argument other than for as much international cooperation in space as we can muster. We have brain power does not respect boundaries, international boundaries. Intelligence does not respect international boundaries, and there are these other aspects, learning to work together, that we ought to be applying.
So it's more than money. I mean, it's more than money.
I would actually, in fact, I'll repeat an argument that I used to make in Congress to deaf ears. Every argument in Congress when I was visiting, deaf ears. But in fact, money is the only reason. It is the only thing that is not a reason to cooperate internationally. Yeah. And one of the concerns that I've had for decades now, I hate to say that I can say anything I've thought for decades, I'm getting old, is the notion that it is economically valuable to share the cost of science or other kinds of exploratory endeavors. You know, when you think about saving for your retirement account, you don't say, well, I don't need to save because Joe across the street is saving. Right? What is important is the investment you make. And when we do science, when we explore space, when we go to another planet, the value accrues to doing it. Mm-hmm. And so, in fact, saving money is the only argument that is not valid for international cooperation, because all the value that we achieve from it is by doing it ourselves. Now, there are other ways to achieve value.
That's been our experience with the International Space Station, too. I think we have fooled ourselves a little bit, perhaps for political purposes, to say that we can do it cheaper because no single nation can afford to do it anymore, so we better pool our resources. However, what I've been finding even this week, renegotiating what we call a balance of contributions with my Russian counterparts, is that our value returned is essentially what our investment put in is. And so it's not that we, certainly America, has the financial resources to remount an expedition to the moon or onto Mars. I think there's other things, both plus and minus, that come with international cooperation. It is far more humanly rewarding to do things in an international environment. It is also more stimulating intellectually, I think, from the standpoint of bringing solutions to the table. It's just astounding to see the different approaches and how they solve problems from different cultures. But I think we fool ourselves sometimes that we're going to save money in the process.
Lee, in thinking about all this stuff today, I've been blessed to have an opportunity to spend time in a number of different cultures in the world, and we are unique in the United States. of the cultures to which I have been exposed, so that's not a lot, but the ones to which I've been exposed, we are the only culture that has no concept of time. Time to us is in minutes and days, and maybe weeks and months at the most. Every other culture in which I have existed, whether it's Russian, Japanese, Thai, I spent some time, with other people, Muslim people. Their concept of time is in generations. And so they teach us, they have taught me the wisdom of patience and doing things for the benefit of my kids and my grandkids, and recognizing the fact that I'm not going to see the benefit of what I do. And having grandkids, I tell you, it's changed my life. Seriously, and the grandparents around here will tell you that. With your own kids, you're stuck in the American way, the Western way of thinking. With grandkids, you do stuff for them, recognizing the fact that if God blesses you, you may see some of that return, but more than likely, you're not going to see the result of the investment that you made for them. And that's what I've learned from all these other cultures to whom we have been exposed by the virtue of participation in the space program, in an international program like space.
Let me ask, yes.
No, I was just...
Chris, go ahead and then Lee.
When people talk about international cooperation in space, the fact that they talk about it is tremendous. And if you look at Apollo-Soyuz, Shuttle Mir, and the space station, space, no matter what has been happening diplomatically around the world, has always had fantastic cooperation. One of the first pan-European organizations was the European Space Agency, and before that, the Launch Vehicle Organization. It's one of the few things that the Europeans truly cooperate on. And I'm just repeating something from John Logston at George Washington University. He said that if the only thing we learned from the International Space Station program and the Shuttle Mir program was how to cooperate better with each other, then the entire thing has been worth it, despite the cost. As Mr. Precourt and Mr. Titov were saying, 20 years ago, what were they doing? And look where they are today. It's space is pushing the diplomatic boundaries as well as the technological and societal boundaries. And we shouldn't lose track of that. That's a very important thing.
Despite my passionate remarks a while ago, I want to point out some difficulties. If we're going to Mars to look for life or for evidence of past life, we have to remember that we've done it before. On the Viking lander, the smartest biologists in our country, all members of the National Academy of Sciences, had signed up to do an experiment in which they would culture whatever bacteria were there, whatever organisms were there. You understand? It turned out to be negative. Was there a mistake? Did they assume that any organisms on Mars would respond to culturing the way they do here on Earth? We don't know. Okay. Was there a mistake because we didn't know how to expose that culture to the right parts of the materials on the Martian surface? We don't know. When we send this wonderful pair of American probes, which will land in January, and of course the Japanese probe is having some difficulty right at the moment, but if we send them there, will they know how to look for the evidence of life? Let me point out that the only clue to possible life, not confirmed life, that we have on Mars right now comes from a meteorite. This is Allen Hills 84001. Allen Hills is a little lumpy area in the great Antarctic ice sheet. It's higher, and there are places where ice is coming up and then flowing down. In a meteorite, that's 84001, some of the people here in Houston at the JSC made some observations which they found were unlike anything that had been seen on a meteorite before. And that got a lot of attention. George made sure it got a lot of attention. Right? It was a first-rate effort at trying to see whether these could possibly be fossil evidence of past life. It started an incredible controversy in the science community. The controversy hasn't gone down. And then I ask you whether or not the current experimenters who will land something on Mars, it's not a robotic experiment, it's a manned experiment using remote efforts, do they know how to establish the presence of modern microbial life? Do they know how to look for fossils? This is something that there are a cadre of people in the world who've spent a long time learning how to do that. And in the terrestrial environment, they've learned to be very successful. But do we know how to prospect for life on Mars? Well, there's only one way to know, and that's to start and try and make your mistakes. And if you haven't done it, see if you can pick up clues as to how you can do it better. There still is so much for the human mind to do in these kinds of experiments. And I'm saying to you, robotic attempts to solve the fundamental problems we're trying to get aren't assured successes because we have so much to learn. I'm not going to knock my colleagues at JPL. I work with them all the time. I'm just saying you have to learn how to deal with a search in that environment. There's so many examples of this. Do you know that Canada is about to become one of the most important diamond-producing countries in the world? Do you know how diamonds were finally discovered in Canada? By the human mind figuring out a prospecting technique. By an old geezer who happened to be an old friend of mine, remembering that he had seen certain things when he was 26 years old, mapping in the Northwest Territories. And then putting it together, the human recognition of what the signature might be. And by gosh, they found those diamonds. And there is a producing thing. But it isn't something that's written up in any textbook. It isn't a written law, you understand? We have to learn how to do all these things, and when it comes to the question of looking for signs of life, we've got a lot to learn. I hope we hit a home run on those two Caltech JPL missions, but I'm concerned.
Okay, I think a response, and then I think we need to get to our reception where people can continue this discussion. Go ahead, Gene.
Again, I think that there is less disagreement than there seems to be on the surface. I mean, one of the fallacies, the long-time fallacies of the American space program has been the pretense that that great accomplishment happens in discrete steps. I mean, great accomplishment comes from repetitive investigation and analysis and thinking. Right? Again, the only issue is how you get the data. Right? There's no doubt in my mind, and perhaps because I've associated with your colleague Jerry Wasserberg for too many years and too great intensity, there's no doubt in my mind that there is no substitute for a human being in close proximity to a rock for that kind of analysis, which is why I've been, for example, a long-time advocate of Mars sample return. And so I don't think there's any disagreement. This is a human activity. It is the human mind integrating vast amounts of information, vast amount of perception. There is a question, I think, at this time in the development of the human species, in terms of what we're going to spend on this and other things, in terms of what our capabilities are, in terms of what the inherent limitations of a real human being conducting safe activity under realistic conditions in that room that moves around with arms, called a spacesuit, can really accomplish, restricted to the flat terrains, because the rest of the planet is too dangerous to enter. I mean, realistically, I don't believe that you can make an analogy between exploring Canada and exploring Mars with a human being, at least not for the long-term foreseeable future. But we certainly agree. It is the human mind, the adaptable human mind, being able to iterate and reiterate investigation, not pretending that within the next budget cycle or within the current presidential administration, we will discover X, Y, or Z.
So on that political note, agreeing that the human mind is important, let's thank this panel for just a wonderful discussion. And I apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but in a moment, with a little wine, maybe the questions will even flow more freely and the answers be even more candid than we already had. And again, I thank the panelists for their candor and for having some provoking comments and some debate. It kept us all alive and awake, and now we will go have our wine and enjoy one another socially. Thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you.